Hello and welcome back to the Librarian of the Rings. Today we're going to be talking about the first 3 episodes of Rings of Power Season 2. Welcome back. My name is Ben. I'm the librarian, and today we're going to be looking at the first 3 episodes of Rings of Power Season 2. They were all dropped on August 29th, and I've had a few days to try and catch up with them and watch through them. Now, as I said in my last video, I've been pretty busy with family stuff, so I haven't had a chance to watch them multiple times, and I wasn't able to watch them all kind of in one chunk. This is more than 3 hours of content that they dropped on us all at once. I'm not going to try and do a full recap or analysis of each of the episodes. I'm just going more to give my feelings on Season 2, the points that I'm liking and the points that I'm not liking as much. Now, some people think that I just love Rings of Power, and that's not really true. I think that there are problems with Rings of Power. I always said about Season 1 that I like the first half better than the latter half, where things kind of got murky with the lore. It's not that I just love Rings of Power, but it's that I'm here to give Rings of Power a chance, and I hope that Rings of Power, whether it's good or not, will lead more people into the Tolkien legendarium, that more people will want to read things like the Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales, and that's what I aim to help people do here on this channel. So already out of the gate with these first 3 episodes, there are things that I'm liking, there are things that I'm not liking as much, there's things that I'm still confused about, and there's just a lot of things to wonder about. So I just have a few of them I'm going to hit on. I'm not going to talk about every single thing here. First off, let's just talk about space and time compression. This is something that happened in the Jackson films, but it's happening on an even larger scale in Rings of Power. Space and time are being compressed so that people can travel quickly from one point to another to move the story forward, and also time is being compressed a lot. If you actually look at the Tale of Years in Appendix B, which should be their source material for this, there's a lot of things here that are happening simultaneously that shouldn't be, like the forging of the rings and the things that are happening in Numenor with Muriel and Pharazôn. There's a lot of things happening here that are just kind of crunched down. Now, we knew this was always going to be the case with Rings of Power. It was the case in Season 1. It's maybe even more apparent already in Season 2 with just how these things are being compressed. And that has a lot to do with how they want to tell the story in the film medium. It's something that happens in a lot of stories when they're adapted. It's not necessarily like super upsetting to me. Honestly, the space compression, not such a big deal. I don't need to watch them writing forever. But the time compression is a little bit more difficult to deal with, as things are happening maybe not in the same order or even with the same characters that they should be. One point here in these first 3 episodes is Pelargir, the settlement that we see Isildur and Irondir and Theo at in episode 3. Pelargir is built there, and then it looks like it was abandoned, and now they are going back to it. And so the timing of that is just weird considering where it should be in the Tale of Years. But they're taking a notable place, and for the Numenorians especially, they're trying to just stick with this core set of characters that they want to keep alive throughout the entire series, whereas a lot of this stuff should be happening with other Numenorian characters way before Muriel and Pharazôn and Elendil and Isildur and all of that. So there's a lot of that happening right here. I really suggest that if you want to know how things were really kind of put together by Tolkien, that you go ahead and you do look in the back of The Return of the King and read Appendix B, The Tale of Years, so that you can get a better grasp of that. Also in the Silmarillion, there is a whole part on the fall of Numenor that deals a lot with this. And also at the very end, there is Of the Rings of Power and the Third Age, which will tell you a lot about the things that are happening here as well. There's also more in Unfinished Tales, which is another good place to go and look for some of this Second Age content. Now, as I've said in videos before, there's not a lot in Second Age. It's very sketchy, in the sense not that it's like weird, but in the sense that it's very much in a sketch stage. Tolkien didn't really develop the Second Age nearly as much as the First or Third Ages. And so they're dealing with kind of a sketch that they're working within, and then they're compressing that down for TV. And it can be a little jarring at certain times, depending on how familiar you are with the story, how people just magically are transporting from A to B without any magical explanation. It's not like they're going through a portal or something, right? They're just like riding horses, and they're able to just arrive from Eregion to Lindon. Just like Sauron, he's able to somehow ride his horse from Mordor over to Eregion very, very quickly. But that was happening in the first season as well. So now that we've kind of got that out of the way, let's talk about a few of the points in the stories. And I want to talk about some that maybe aren't as obvious. The first one that kind of bothers me here is Poppy. So Poppy is the Harfoot that is friends with Nori. And at the end of Season 1, they left Poppy with the main group of Harfoots, and the stranger and Nori were going off on their own. Now, almost immediately in this season, we have Poppy show up. So Nori and the stranger wander around in circles for a little bit, and then Poppy just just shows up somehow having been able to track them. Now they have been kind of trying to build up Poppy's wayfinding nature a little bit more, so maybe that's where they're kind of pulling this from, but all of a sudden she just shows up, they catch her in a trap because they think someone nefarious is following them, and then Poppy is able to immediately, using the Wandering Song, get them on the right track, and then they progress very quickly through the steps of the Wandering Song. Now I really liked the Wandering Song from season 1, but this just felt a little bit misplaced, and I wasn't someone who hated the Harfoot storyline in season 1 at all. I thought it was a pretty good storyline, but just having Poppy show up and then just immediately guide them through was kind of weird for me. So I hope that they're really trying to build up Poppy's wayfinding for some reason, that's going to be important later on, because they're really making it seem like she knows what she's doing and is able to get these other two who are just wandering around on the right track quickly. I'm just not sure why they had to bring Poppy in so soon. They had the Stranger Nori leave Poppy behind at the end of season 1, so why then immediately bring her back in? They could have just all started out together and gone on. It didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So it's probably not a major problem with the plot, it just was something that kind of annoyed me. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about the character of Kieran. This is a character that I have not quite been able to figure out in the story. Now it was one that I think many of us were excited to see portrayed on screen, because Kieran is a character throughout the Tolkien Legendarium, but he hasn't really ever gotten a portrayal before. Elrond goes to him and he seems like he's this really, really wise elf, and he should be, because he's like super old, so old in fact that he can grow a beard, which they do show, and it seems like he's going to help Elrond get rid of the three rings, and then he doesn't, and it's still confusing to me whether this was a point of divine intervention, that the wave that knocks the rings down into the boat is coming from the Valar, or if it's something else, and I hope that it is, but it's just not quite making sense with the way the rings are being portrayed in this story. So it's hard to know. Then we see Kieran shaving and looking much younger once he has the Ring of Fire. So I don't know if the ring is causing some de-aging or something like that. So I'm interested to see where they go with Kieran's character. I really hope that Kieran is pretty solidly always a good guy and not really being deceived, because it seems like where he should be. In fact, of all the people who have rings in the Lord of the Rings, Kieran seems to be the least impacted by it. He easily gives it up to Gandalf when Gandalf arrives in Middle-earth, and he doesn't seem to have much trouble as far as that goes. I really hope that we see him not really being influenced by the ring, but kind of seemed like he was being influenced by the ring in these episodes, so I'm just a little bit worried about that. So speaking of the rings, I'm still confused, and this was one of my sticking points in season 1, about the tree in Lindon and its corruption and death, and that affecting the elves. The fading of the elves is a very consistent theme in Tolkien's work. He basically had the fading of the elves planned all the way through. There were certainly modifications to it as he went along, but I don't understand its connection to the tree. Now, where I'm kind of giving them some grace on this is that if Tolkien had maybe written more of this Second Age stuff out, maybe there would have been a tree. There's just a lot of really important trees. Trees play a really important role and are often connected to significant events. So that's where I'm giving them some grace here, but I still don't understand this tree and why its corruption is so linked to the elves that Gil-galad is so concerned about it, or how the rings actually heal it. But in the show, the tree does get healed as soon as they put the rings on, so not sure what's going to be going on with that, and I still feel like I need some more explanation about that beyond this apocryphal tale that Elrond and Gil-galad talked about in season 1 that talks about the Mithril being formed from the light of the Silmarils, which doesn't make a whole ton of sense. And I hope that we come back to it and get some more explanation, and that we aren't just moving on now that the tree is healed. So speaking of the Silmarils, I want to talk a little bit about Celebrimbor and his parallels to Feanor here. It seems like they're really playing up these parallels to Feanor without specifically talking about Feanor a lot. They talked about Feanor briefly in season 1, and they showed us his hammer, and Celebrimbor is actually the grandson of Feanor, so there's a family connection there. And I'm not going to go into all the history of Feanor here, just know that he's not great, but he creates the greatest thing people have ever seen, which is the Silmarils. And they really seem to be playing that out with Celebrimbor. Now, Celebrimbor certainly seems to be living in the shadow of his grandfather, and he wants to prove that he is the best smith that the elves have ever had. And that's where he's becoming subject to the influence of Sauron here, as he wants to be able to create something so great. And it seems like in the show he's achieved that, because Kieran says at the beginning that perfection exists only in Valinor, and then once he sees the rings he says perfection does not exist only in Valinor. So he's saying the rings are perfect, basically. So they're showing Celebrimbor as this very driven craftsman who wants to achieve the greatness that his grandfather had, or maybe something even greater. That's interesting, and I think it works here in the show pretty well. It's going to be really interesting to see how it plays out. Now, should the rings and the Silmarils be compared to each other? I'd say yes in a lot of ways, because Tolkien actually wanted kind of the whole story of the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings to be published together as the great story of the jewels and the rings. So they were certainly kind of paralleled in his mind. These wonderful, beautiful objects that were created and ultimately have a detrimental effect on the people who are near them or using them. So that's going to be interesting to see how those parallels with Celebrimbor and Fëanor go going forward, and whether or not they become more explicit. There's only so much they can do with the Silmarillion content because they don't have the rights to it. While we're talking about Celebrimbor, I also want to bring up Narvi. So Narvi is a new dwarf being introduced this season. Narvi is one of the dwarf's greatest craftsmen, and he is supposed to work with Celebrimbor on those iconic doors of Durin that you saw in The Lord of the Rings. So we should see Narvi and Celebrimbor develop a close friendship, but we're 3 episodes in and we haven't even had them meet each other yet. So I'm glad we're getting Narvi here, but I hope they give enough time for Narvi and Celebrimbor to develop a relationship and have a reason to build these gates together, because otherwise it's not going to feel like they kind of got their due. And I'm not sure how that's going to happen, where Celebrimbor seems to be best friends with Annatar or Sauron right now. I'm not sure how they're going to then develop Celebrimbor's relationship with Narvi enough to bring us that moment and have a reason for making the gates, while still having the gates open long enough for them to be meaningful before they are shut when Sauron reveals himself in Saxaragian. So that all has to do with time compression again, but I just hope that there's enough time there. Speaking of Celebrimbor and Annatar's relationship, I want to talk a little bit about that, because that I think has been one of the highlights for me so far, is seeing Sauron able to manipulate Celebrimbor. He's manipulating many things in these first 3 episodes, but his relationship with Celebrimbor is of course the most important, and he reveals himself eventually as Annatar, claiming that he is a messenger from the Valar and that he is there to help him. And to just see how he tweaks things and manipulates Celebrimbor. It's obvious to the viewers, and I think it's supposed to be that he's manipulating them, but to Celebrimbor, it's not obvious that he is being so manipulated. So even though he had received warning from Galadriel not to treat with him, because Galadriel had not explained that Halbrand was Sauron, Celebrimbor is now in this spot where he is being manipulated into doing the will of Sauron. I think this part is being pretty well put together, and I think this is what a lot of people wanted to see, and what they thought had been lost at the end of season 1, because the 3 rings were made so quickly. They thought this wasn't going to happen, but again, timing and events are all being squished together and moved around, and so we're seeing this now. Okay, as a separate thing here in season 2, I want to talk about the orcs. We already knew from season 1 that the orcs were being humanized in a big way. They were being shown as more sympathetic characters. This whole Adar storyline, which doesn't exist in any of Tolkien's writings, is kind of leading us into understanding maybe the orcs better. They're still pretty gruesome, but we're seeing a little bit more of their history. And I really am interested to see how this turns out, because even though they're doing that, they've still been pretty gratuitous with orc killings here. Orcs are just getting killed all the time and don't really care about, both in season 1 and already a little bit in season 2. So we have this whole thing where Adar killed Sauron, or thought he had, in order to save the orcs from being enslaved to Sauron, and now we're going to see how this turns out. And they're definitely trying to humanize them more here by giving us some of Adar's backstory, talking about kind of him being an elf, and then meeting with Sauron and being sort of transformed into what he is now, which is sort of half elf, half orc kind of thing, and then his children are the orcs. And speaking of children, we actually see in episode 3 a baby orc, and that is a big departure from previous media adaptations such as the Peter Jackson films, which showed orcs basically being born out of slime pits, but now we see a baby and maybe even like a little orc family, and so that's definitely trying to make us more sympathetic to the orcs. And I'm just interested to see where that goes, because we know there's going to be just a huge battle between the elves and the orcs in the Sack of Aragian. So I don't know how that's all going to play out, with us supposedly being brought into a more sympathetic stance toward the orcs, certainly than we were in the Peter Jackson films or even in Tolkien's own books. Now, what's important to understand about the orcs is that Tolkien never really settled the question for himself about the orcs. He had several different versions of the way orcs were created. They certainly are going here with the one that is in the published Silmarillion, which is that a group of elves get tortured and eventually produce the orcs. But there were a lot of different writings that Tolkien had about orcs, and he certainly tried to work them out and was never quite clear on the question of them having free will or not, and kind of how they were manipulated into being the forces of darkness that we see. Okay, so those are just a few of the points. There was a ton of stuff packed into these first 3 episodes, more than I can cover here with the time that I have. But I would love to hear some of your thoughts down below. Now, as always with Rings of Power content, because there is so much hatred online, I will moderate all of the comments on this video in order to make sure that only appropriate ones get through. So if you are going to comment, please do so in a kind and respectful way. This is only season 2 of 5, so there's still a lot for us to explore and find out here along the way. And that's going to do it for us today. Until next time, farewell wherever you fare. May your ears receive you at your journey's end.